All right, so we're back. We're sort of leaning into this idea of how do we seek God in the midst of sheltering in place?
Yeah.
How do we seek God in the midst of COVID-19? How are we faithful in this season?
Sure.
Right, and so far, right, we've gone through Genesis, we've hit Exodus, we've hit creation, we've hit Exodus, but two big buckets.
Sure, yeah.
And I know today you're wanting to lean into Exile, but at least as I understand the history and the chronology, like to go from Exodus, the freeing of the people, they're in the wilderness, they haven't even gotten to the promised land.
Totally, yeah.
And now we're going to jump into Exile when they're kicked out of the promised land. Like, there's a lot of time there.
Totally, oh yeah.
Maybe you could sketch that really briefly.
Sure.
And then we can get into sort of the exile motif and why you think it's
important. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So like you're saying, Exile, this is kind of the third bucket that I wanted to highlight. Creation, Exodus, Exile. Yeah. And really Exile is kind of a way to encapsulate a lot of Israel's quote unquote history and what we normally think of as like the narrative history of Israel. So you're right. You talk about Israel, they're freed, Red Sea, they go through the wilderness, they're at Mount Sinai for about a year, they're trekking through the wilderness for about 40 years because of some disobedience. Yeah. They get into the promised land at the beginning of the book of Joshua. So as the Torah closes, Deuteronomy closes, Moses dies, passes the baton off to Joshua, his successor. And the book of Joshua opens with kind of this commissioning from God to Joshua to be faithful, to stick close to God's instructions, and he's going to bless Joshua and through Joshua kind of bring out the fruition of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here's the land I'm going to give you. So Joshua and the gang basically just go through the land, and Joshua kind of recounts sort of how the land is acquired by the people of Israel. There's the Battle of Jericho, a lot of famous stories in the book of Joshua. There's high points and low points, as always, throughout these narratives. By the time you get to the end of the book of Joshua, for the most part, it seems like things are going well. They're off to a good start. Joshua and Caleb are kind of the main leaders at this point of the story. The story then transitions to the next book, the book of Judges, and kind of the narrative kind of recounts a little bit of what happened in the life of Joshua at the beginning of the book of Judges, but there's a couple narrative details that kind of give a clue as to things aren't actually going to go so well for Israel going on. One of the things that they mentioned, the book of Judges mentions, is that a lot of what Joshua and that generation, the Promised Land generation, learned and kind of adhered to and obeyed wasn't necessarily being passed down to the successive generations. Yeah. So there's this kind of gap between kind of God's ways and God's instructions being passed down.
And what the people are actually doing.
Exactly. Yeah. So what ends up happening then is you have the book of Judges sort of kind of start with so chapter 1 is basically the introduction to the book of Judges. Chapters 2 through about 16, there's a repetition of 7 cycles where essentially Israel gets into some sort of disobedience, in trouble, does something wrong. They cry out to God. God raises up a deliverer or a judge. That's where that language comes from. God brings some restoration, some forgiveness, some healing.
So good stuff
happens, but then Israel falls back into rebellion again. That cycle repeats itself 7 times over throughout the majority of the first half of the book of Judges.
And 7's kind of an important
number. So it's like this kind of this complete failure that's happening in the book of Judges. And then at the end of the book of Judges, there's this refrain that happens over and over. Two refrains, actually. Number 1, the people did what was right in their own eyes, and that line gets repeated over and over.
Which seems very similar to Eve in the garden.
Exactly, totally. So you have the eye idea, exactly. So it's the fall motif, just on a grander scale, happening at the end of the book of Judges, really throughout. So that's the first line that gets repeated. And then the second line that gets repeated often at the end of the book of Judges is, in Israel or in the land there was no king. And it's kind of leading you into what will happen next. We need a king around here. So it's crying out. So what we need around here is a king.
But not God as king, but an earthly king that will sort of make us like the nation.
Like the nation. So that's what happens when you transition to the next sequence of narrative books, is the books of Samuel and Kings come next. And Samuel kind of comes onto the scene, the book of Samuel does, and it kind of starts off with Israel's first king as kind of the main part of the narrative, King Saul. But King Saul doesn't go well. There's some things.
He's tall and handsome.
He's handsome.
He's not the king that God is looking for.
Exactly. And which it's an important motif that happens, because what we're going to see is here's God choosing and selecting and working through not how necessarily man sees. This is kind of the famous line in the book of Samuel. Yeah. God doesn't see as man sees, but God looks at the heart.
The tiny David.
The tiny David, exactly. Yeah. So Saul rises to power, but in the midst of Saul's rising to power, his arrogance, his pride get in the way. He has sort of a downfall, basically, while simultaneously the little shepherd boy David gets anointed as king. And there's the jealousy and the strife that happens mostly, obviously, really all from Saul towards David. Yeah. King David's going to rise to power. You have the David and Goliath story. But what happens from there is, as David's rising to power and as David, essentially sits on the throne of Israel, it becomes this high point for the nation of Israel. Mm-hmm. He defeats Goliath. Yeah. Israel is very prosperous. Yeah. So much of like all of the Eden Abrahamic blessings are happening. Like
they're coming to
it's like happening. Like this is it. This is like the high point. And really one of the major high points is God establishes or reestablishes or reaffirms his promise to David that through his line, 2 Samuel 7, that there's going to be a king and a kingdom that will never end through him.
Yeah, which feels like Abraham and Genesis 12, Genesis 15, like that sort of promise motif
keeps going. All happens again, right? And so 2 Samuel 7, that's a key chapter in the biblical story to kind of have in the back of your head. That's God establishing his covenant or promise with David. But as the story continues, David has, we've mentioned it a few episodes ago too, his sort of major fall story with Bathsheba, where he sees Bathsheba, she's good in his eyes, and takes Bathsheba. And from there, David essentially has his sort of descending. Exactly. So he goes into his own exile. Absalom, his son, he has some problems with his son. There's the last half of David's life, at least as the narrative portrays it, is generally not all that great.
And then Solomon, his son. He has some great stuff. The temple, some really good stuff. But he also goes wayward.
He goes wayward for sure. And just a couple quick things to point out with Solomon. Solomon, he rises to power. He is actually another high point in Israel's history where the kingdom's united. Like you said, the temple is built. Mm-hmm. He's almost depicted as like a new Adam. He asked for wisdom to be able to discern good and evil. So it's great, this is the
Eve, right, and the serpent, right? If you eat it, it'll make you wise.
And so he asked for God's wisdom on God's own terms. But what's very interesting is that it's a very sort of human motif, right? Mm-hmm. The more power, the more pride one gets, the greater the downfall in a lot of ways. And what happens with Solomon is he almost verbatim starts doing. There's one paragraph in the Torah in Deuteronomy 17. That gives the instructions for the kings of Israel, what they were supposed to do and what they were not supposed to. And almost verbatim, Solomon starts to do exactly what Deuteronomy 17, the king was not supposed to do.
Wow.
He requires many wives. He makes alliances and relationships with other foreign nations. He's accumulating all this wealth. He is using forced labor, just like Egypt was, to build his palace, which ends up taking twice as long as God's temple. And so there's this inversion that's happening where it's all becoming about Solomon. Yeah. And all of that pride and all that arrogance leads Solomon to this point where he begins to descend as well. Even though he was like a new Adam, even though things were prosperous, things begin to descend. And what eventually happens, again, this is all very big picture here. Solomon and the kingdom, after Solomon, the kingdom gets split up into basically two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, which is the 10 tribes to the north, and then Judah and the southern kingdom. There's 2 tribes in the south. Right now? So now we're into the Kings, the book of Kings.
First and Second Kings.
Yeah, so First and Second Kings follow First and Second Samuel, and this really begins the Solomon part of the story, the earlier part of this in the book of First Kings. But then you
start having this repeating motif.
Motif, yeah. So what you end up seeing is that after Solomon, the book of Kings begins to trace these 2 kingdoms side by side. And you'll get the narratives of, in this, age or in this era, King so-and-so reigned for X amount of years, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Yeah. And then every once in a while, you get a little bit more details as to what happened and whatnot.
And it descends and it descends. And then eventually, Josiah comes on
the scene. There's like these high points. So for most of all of the kings in the north, they basically all get a poor grade on like doing well in the eyes of the Lord. Yeah. There's a few kings in the southern kingdom that actually get like a thumbs up, you know, hey, well done. Yeah. So Josiah is one of them. Hezekiah has a few high points as well as the narrative progresses. But overall, there is essentially this descent that's happening where whether it's idolatry or going after foreign gods or whatever the case might be.
And so what you're doing is you're setting the arc of how do we get from Exodus, we're in the promised land, to now get into exile.
Exactly.
You're showing, sort of illustrating through Judges or through Joshua, then Judges, through the life of Saul and David and
all the kings Solomon, that follow.
And then all the kings that follow, this general trajectory of, we thought it was going to go this way.
Yeah.
It hasn't, and it's actually getting worse.
It's getting worse, exactly. And so what ends up happening, a couple things, is that the covenant that God had established with Israel, Moses talks about at the end of Deuteronomy, that if you basically adhere to the covenant and follow God's ways, it's the blessing and curse motif that Moses talks about. But if you go your own way, Moses even says at the end of Deuteronomy, you will end up essentially in exile. Yeah. Like this was part of kind of the agreement. The agreement, essentially, exactly. And that gets reiterated multiple times, not just in Deuteronomy, but throughout a lot of these narratives. And so what ends up happening is that in about 720, I can't remember the exact date, but 720-ish BC, Assyria comes and essentially wipes out the northern 10 tribes and takes them into exile.
Yeah. So you first have two tribes,
two kingdoms, exactly.
The Assyrians come in, they take out the northern kingdom.
Northern kingdom.
So sometimes we sort of converge these or merge them. But really, the northern kingdom's knocked out first.
Knocked out first.
Then the Assyrians come down, and they're basically knocking on the door of the southern kingdom.
The southern kingdom. And there's a little bit of a reprieve there where they don't initially... Well, the Assyrians don't actually end up taking over Jerusalem.
And the southern kingdom looks towards Egypt.
Yeah.
As like, Egypt's going to help us.
Yeah.
But then something happens with the Assyrians.
Yeah. So they get wiped out essentially by the Babylonians.
Who are behind them. So they're on the flank, what is that? Eastern flank.
Eastern flank, yeah.
And they take out, so then the Assyrians have to retreat to fight them.
Yeah.
The Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians approach.
The Babylonians approach, yeah. So now we're talking, it's about 587, 586 so 100 BC. Years? About, a little over 100 years later. Yeah. Eventually, Babylon comes and essentially destroys Jerusalem for the most part, destroys the temple, and hauls a majority of the Jewish people, I don't know what the geography is, but many miles to the east.
And that's kind of the narrative of Habakkuk, I think. Habakkuk's calling out, saying, God, help us. And God's like, no. So I'm going to bring the Babylonians to rescue you. And he's like, what?
Like, well, how is that going to happen? They're even worse. Yeah. So this is like, you try to think this is the biggest, baddest, most powerful empire at this point in human history is the Babylonians. And they're the ones that are going to come through and essentially wipe out and take Israel out.
So maybe, is it fair to summarize, like you have, 300 years or so between Joseph and the Exodus, right? There's a gap there. Mm-hmm. And we summarize that whole thing by Exodus.
Exodus, yeah.
In the same way, right? So really, the Exodus isn't that few years, where God actually liberates them, that process. Yeah. But it sort of captures that whole story. When we say exile, we're not just talking about the year Babylon breaks in. We're talking about that narrative and what exile then represents.
Yeah. It's, you try to imagine yourself as like an ancient Israelite. You have all of the hopes and the expectations and the promises. You have all of these stories of creation and Exodus in your past.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, within a few generations, that whole narrative, all those promises come crumbling down, and you're in a foreign land or you're displaced, and things as you know it will pretty much never be the same.
Yeah.
And it's this complete sudden shift.
Because when we get to the New Testament, like we think, exile, that was this time. But really, like...
it's continuing.
Yeah, they're really looking for a new Exodus in the midst of a current exile. Because they're still ruled. I mean, the Maccabees, they have a little season. If this is too deep, like, we don't need to go there.
Totally,
but have a little season when the Maccabees actually exert. So they are able to overthrow their tormentors. There's a little bit of freedom. But then quickly, there's, Rome comes in. There's other people that end up being their landlords.
Basically,
so essentially, you're in the promised land, but you're not free.
You're not free, exactly. And so
they
that's...
return from Babylon, but they're still longing to sort of in a heart way to return from exile.
Totally, exactly. That's even when the books of Ezra and Nehemiah come into play, where there's a wave of exiles that are allowed to come back to the promised land. But by the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, there's the cry of the people like, we're in our land, but we're not free. Exactly what you're saying. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of like this ski jump into the New Testament in a way of, some of us might be back in the land. Not actually everyone was. Many of the Jews are scattered throughout the known world still.
And that exists to this day.
To this day, exactly. Yeah. And so there's still this longing of, God to come back. There's still this longing of God to be faithful to the covenant. And that's essentially how the New Testament and Jesus comes onto the scene, which we'll get into in a couple of weeks here, of Jesus sees himself as bringing this new Exodus and this new return from exile. Yeah. And basically trying to bring about all of the hopes and the promises that Isaiah and so many of the prophets were looking forward to in the midst of the displacement and the exile.
Okay.
So that's kind of a 30,000 foot sort of overview. I have.
So then so you go from that, right? So you have the 30,000 foot overview.
Yeah.
So then how does exile sort of hit the ground for us?
Totally. Yeah. And so I think if I had to kind of boil it down into kind of 3 or so main books of the Bible that I think really help us in kind of get us feeling this exile motif and what it looks like to live in this sort of state. The Psalms would be one, and we're going to mainly focus on the Psalms today.
That's the prayer book of the Hebrew Bible. So that's
exactly.
Songs and prayers.
Songs and prayers. So there's worship, there's lament, there's all these different kind of ways to respond and interact with God in there. The book of Isaiah. Yeah. And Isaiah more so just representative of the prophets in general, because the prophets they come onto the scene as Israel's kings are rising to power and they're kind of going their own way. The prophets kind of come alongside as like calling out all of the ways that Israel's kings are not fulfilling the covenant.
God speaks through the prophets to the people to invite them to return to the covenant promises. To God, and they keep going in their own way, which then leads to exile.
Totally, yeah. One Tim Mackey calls them the covenant watchdogs. They're like, basically trying to bring Israel back to the covenant, but they're also offering these glimmers and these promises of hope.
Yeah, future hope.
A future hope, exactly. That Israel's disobedience does not get the final word. God's faithfulness and God's promises will still come to pass. Yeah. So that's Isaiah, and really the latter half of Isaiah really hits on.
In the same way, there's tohu and bohu. There's chaos at the beginning, and God brings order and beauty. In the same way, in the midst of the disorder, the disordered loves of the Jewish people under the kings, like the prophets are saying, you guys, you need to return, but even if you don't, God is going to bring beauty and order and goodness out of whatever happens.
Yeah, remember even just real quickly the story in Genesis 15 that we often talk about of God walking through twice as he's making that covenant with Abraham, signifying even if Abraham and his family break their end of the covenant, God will still be faithful. And so Isaiah and the prophets represent that. So you have the Psalms, Isaiah and the prophets. We'll mainly focus on the second half of Isaiah. Yeah. And then the book of Daniel, really the first half or so of the book of Daniel kind of gives us a window into actually living faithfully in exile. Yeah. When the world and the culture goes this way or that way, being faithful to the narrative of Yahweh, in Daniel's case, what does that actually look like? Yeah. So you have worship, lament, prayers in the Psalms. You have both the covenant and the promises in Isaiah and the prophets. And then you have like the living faithfully in the midst of all that in the book of Daniel. And so what I want to do is really kind of press in even more on the Psalms. So just as a quick side note as well, all of that 30,000 overview that we were just kind of dialoguing there for the past 10 minutes or so, there's a whole bunch of notes for those of your people who are interested that want to kind of
you thought more
draw down deep. Right, so there's a whole thing of like, you have the dates of kind of all these things that we were talking about here. And then even if someone's interested, on page 55 of the notes, there's kind of have a chart of how the different books of the Bible fit into at least when those events happened during the course of history. So
I found those to be helpful just to have some sense of like, how does this history work?
Yeah.
Right. Just like stepping back for a second, because when you read the Bible, it's not chronological.
It's not chronological. Yeah.
And so sometimes we think, I'm just going to read straight through. And sometimes you're like, actually, sometimes reading straight through is actually a little confusing.
Sure, yeah.
Because they don't necessarily, right? So they're organized into 3 major chunks.
Sure,
right?
totally.
So at least in the Tanakh.
In the Tanakh, yeah.
In the Hebrew Bible.
So,
right? So you have the Torah, you have the prophets, and you have the writings.
The writings, yeah. And so I have a whole, we don't have to get into all of that. I have a whole section in here on the Jewish order of the Old Testament. So it's the same books of the Bible that we have in our English Bible, Old Testament, but they're in, like you said, 3 chunks. The Torah, which is the same, first 5 books. The prophets, which include what we think of the history books, but Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then the 3 major prophets in the scroll of the 12 are the prophets, and then the writings, the Psalms, even Ruth is in there, Ecclesiastes.
Scroll of the 12, you mean the
minor prophets,
so there's 12 other
prophets. Yeah, so there's 15, at least how the Jewish ordering of it is. But someday I would love to go into that with people. It's a really, I think, it's helpful to see that because it really shows how the whole Old Testament is ramping us up for looking forward to this prophetic hope of a coming Messiah. And the way the narratives work together, there's intentionality behind that. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. This episode went a tad bit longer than we had anticipated when we recorded it, so we decided to break it up into 2. Next week, we'll take a deep dive into the book of Psalms and just really look at and explore the literary structure of the book and how it really speaks to just the human experience, especially in moments of pain, and also how it offers so much hope for us as well. So look forward to that. If you can, feel free to check out the notes as well. Hopefully you got those. But we look forward to hanging out on Zoom on Wednesday. See you then.